Henry VIII. No king in English history is as famous or as infamous. To understand the man he became, we must go back to the beginning. Born in 1491, Henry was the spare heir. His childhood was spent in the shadow of his brother Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who was being groomed for kingship. While Arthur learned the art of rule, Henry was immersed in the arts, languages, and theology. He was a brilliant student, mastering Latin, French, and Italian. He was also a gifted athlete. He excelled in wrestling, archery, and tennis. He was the golden boy of the Tudor court, adored by his father and the people. His father, Henry VII, had won the crown on the battlefield, ending the Wars of the Roses. He was a cautious king, obsessively building the nation's wealth. In 1502, the dynasty was shaken. Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle. The future of England now rested on the 11-year-old Henry. Henry was moved from the nursery to the centre of power. His father became increasingly protective, rarely letting the new heir out of his sight. When Henry VII died in 1509, the transition was seamless. At just 17, the Golden Prince became King Henry VIII. His first act of state was to marry Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow. It was a marriage of both diplomacy and, at least initially, genuine affection. The early years of their reign were a whirlwind of feasts, masques, and tournaments. Henry was the centre of a vibrant, intellectual court. During this time, Thomas Wolsey rose to power. A butcher's son who became a cardinal, he managed the daily affairs of the kingdom, allowing Henry to hunt and play. In 1520, Henry displayed his magnificence at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was a summit of unprecedented luxury, designed to show England's power to Europe. But beneath the glamour, a tragedy was unfolding. Catherine's first child, a son, lived for only 52 days. The joy of the court turned to mourning. Over the next decade, Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. The hope for a male heir was fading with every passing year. By 1525, only one child remained, the Princess Mary. But to Henry, a female succession was a recipe for civil war. The Tudor dynasty felt fragile. Henry became increasingly anxious. He began to search for a reason for God's apparent displeasure. He found it in a verse from the Bible. He became convinced that his marriage was illegal in the eyes of God because Catherine had been Arthur's wife. He believed he was being punished with childlessness. It was at this moment of spiritual crisis that Anne Boleyn returned to the English court from France. She was sharp, sophisticated, and captivating. Henry was smitten, but Anne refused to be a mistress. She held out for something more. She wanted to be queen. For Henry, she represented the hope of a son. Henry ordered Cardinal Wolsey to secure an annulment from Rome. He expected a quick resolution. He was the King of England, and the Pope was his ally. But the Pope was in a bind. Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had recently sacked Rome and held the Pope as a virtual prisoner. Charles would never allow his aunt to be disgraced. The great matter became a piece in a massive game of European power politics. In 1529, a special court was held at Blackfriars. For the first time, a king and queen were tried in public over the validity of their marriage. Catherine was magnificent. She knelt before Henry, declaring that she had been a virgin when they married. Her defiance won the sympathy of the people. When the court was adjourned without a decision, Wolsey's fate was sealed. He had failed the king. The man who had ruled England for 15 years was cast out. In the vacuum left by Wolsey, new men arose. Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer suggested a radical solution: if Rome wouldn't act, the king must. Henry began to chip away at the Pope's power in England. He demanded that the clergy recognize him as their supreme head. The pressure was mounting. Catherine was separated from her daughter Mary and sent to live in isolation. Henry hoped that hardship would break her will. She remained steadfast. Anne Boleyn was also growing impatient. 7 years had passed since the great matter began. She was getting older, and her position was still precarious. In 1532, Henry and Anne travelled to France to seek the support of King Francis I. They returned more determined than ever. Henry was ready to break with the past. In the winter of 1533, Henry and Anne were married in secret. She was finally pregnant. The king was convinced that his son was finally coming. Parliament passed the laws that made the break official. England was no longer part of the Roman Catholic Church. Henry was the supreme head. The revolution was complete. Catherine was officially demoted to Princess Dowager of Wales. Her marriage was declared null and void. She was a queen no more. In June 1533, Anne was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. It was a triumph of will and ambition. But the cheers of the crowd were thin. Henry was ecstatic. He had his queen, he had his church, and soon he was sure he would have his son. All of England waited with bated breath. But in September, the news arrived. It was a girl, the Princess Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was profound. The Golden Prince was gone. The tyrant was about to emerge. Part 1 ends here. In Part 2, we will see the blood-soaked consequences of Henry's choices, the fall of a queen, and the rise of a new kind of power. Join us next time. By 1534, the Golden Prince was dead. In his place stood a man who would break any law and any person to secure his legacy. The Reformation had begun. Henry demanded that every leader in the land swear an oath recognizing him as the supreme head of the church. To refuse was not just heresy, it was treason. The most famous voice of silence was Sir Thomas More. The king's former friend and chancellor refused to speak against the oath, but he would not swear it. For Henry, silence was a betrayal he could not forgive. In 1535, More was executed. He told the crowd he died as the king's good servant, but God's first. The execution sent a shockwave through Europe. Henry had become a king who killed his friends. Even the mystic Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, was not safe. She prophesied that the king would die if he married Anne Boleyn. Henry had her executed and her head placed on a spike. With his new authority, Henry turned his gaze toward the wealth of the Catholic Church. Thomas Cromwell led the dissolution of the smaller monasteries. Centuries of tradition were dismantled for the royal treasury. Gold, silver, and land flowed to the king. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in English history. Henry was now the richest king in Europe, but he was also the most hated. Anne Boleyn's position was increasingly fragile. She had failed to provide the prince Henry craved. Her wit, once alluring, now felt sharp and annoying to a king who demanded total obedience. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. Within weeks, Anne suffered another miscarriage. This time, it was a son. Henry's patience snapped. He believed this second marriage was also cursed. Henry tasked Thomas Cromwell with finding a way out. Cromwell built a case of adultery and incest against the Queen. Whether the charges were true or not mattered little to the king's goal. Anne was arrested at a tournament at Greenwich. She was taken to the Tower, entering through Traitor's Gate, the same place where her predecessor's supporters had perished. Her trial was a spectacle of political theatre. Even her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sat in judgment. She was found guilty on all counts. The king stayed away, already looking toward his next move. Henry granted Anne a small mercy. She would be executed not with an axe, but with a sword, by a specialist brought from France. On the scaffold, she showed a courage that moved even her enemies. With one stroke, the marriage was ended. Anne Boleyn was dead. Henry was now free to marry the woman who had already caught his eye, Jane Seymour. Within days, Henry married Jane. She was the opposite of Anne, a gentle, submissive, and dedicated to traditional values. For a moment, peace returned to the royal bedchamber. But outside the palace, the north was in flames. The Pilgrimage of Grace was the largest rebellion of the reign. They demanded the return of the old church and the fall of Cromwell. Henry was terrified but cunning. he promised the rebels a parliament in the north to hear their grievances. It was a lie. Once the leaders went home, Henry struck with terrifying force. Over 200 leaders were executed. Monks were hung from their own abbey gates. The message was clear: Henry would tolerate no dissent, whether spiritual or political. In October 1537, the miracle finally happened. At Hampton Court, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy boy, the Prince Edward. Henry wept with joy. The Tudor succession was safe. But the triumph was paid for in blood. 12 days later, Jane died of childbed fever. Henry was genuinely devastated. He went into deep mourning, wearing black for months. She had died giving him his greatest desire. For 3 years, Henry remained unmarried. He was a widower with a son, but his health was starting to fail. The leg injury from a jousting accident was now a chronic, painful ulcer. The pain made him unpredictable. The man who had once been the Golden Prince now saw enemies everywhere. The machinery of state was now a machinery of fear. Part 2 ends here. In our final part, we will see the chaotic final marriages of the king, his descent into total paranoia, and the lasting legacy of a man who changed England forever. Join us. In the final decade of his life, Henry VIII was a man pursued by his own history. The athletic prince was long gone, replaced by a monumental figure of both physical and political weight. By 1539, England was isolated. Thomas Cromwell sought a new alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany. He suggested a fourth marriage to the daughter of the Duke of Cleves. Henry fell in love with the portrait. But when it arrived in England, reality did not match the art. Henry found her lacking in grace and beauty. The marriage was a disaster before it even began. Henry blamed Cromwell for the failure of the Cleves marriage. The man who had dismantled the church and served the king for a decade was suddenly vulnerable. In 1540, Cromwell was arrested and executed. Henry had lost his most capable servant. Desperate to feel young again, the 49-year-old Henry married the 19-year-old Catherine Howard. He called her his rose without a thorn. For a few months, he seemed happy, showering her with jewels. But the marriage was built on a lie. Catherine was young and reckless, and her past romances were discovered. When Henry was presented with the evidence of her infidelity, he reportedly wept in front of his council. In 1542, Catherine Howard followed her cousin Anne Boleyn to the block. She was only 20 years old. Henry's heart was now a fortress of suspicion and pain. He turned his attention to war. Henry spent his final years seeking glory on the battlefield. He led an invasion of France and captured the city of Boulogne. It was a victory, but it was incredibly expensive, nearly bankrupting the country. While watching a naval battle from the shore, Henry saw his flagship, the Mary Rose, sink with hundreds of men on board. It was a devastating blow to the king and his pride in the new Royal Navy. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was a stabilizing presence. She was a scholar who encouraged his children's education and navigated the king's dangerous religious mood swings. She was as much a nurse as a wife. By 1546, Henry could barely walk. He was carried in a trapping chair through the palace. The leg ulcer was a constant, agonizing source of infection. His temper grew shorter, his paranoia deeper. Henry spent his final months obsessing over his will. He established a regency council for his young son Edward and carefully laid out the line of succession: Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII breathed his last. His final words were reportedly, "Monks. Monks. Monks." He died at the age of 55, having reigned for 38 years. He left behind a transformed nation. He had created the Royal Navy from scratch, building the foundation of England's future as a global maritime power. His vision was vast and uncompromising. He had permanently broken the power of Rome in England. By creating the Church of England, he ensured that the English monarch would be the sole authority in a land, both spiritual and temporal. But he also left a country deeply divided. The religious tensions he sparked would lead to decades of conflict and blood during the reigns of his children. The peace he sought for the succession was fragile. History remembers him as a monster, a tyrant who killed his wives and destroyed his friends. But he was also a visionary who shaped the modern English identity. He was a force of nature. The Tudor flame burned through his children, but it was Henry who provided the fuel. From the ruins of the monasteries to the majesty of the navy, his presence is felt in every corner of England to this day. Henry VIII was not simply a king. He was a revolution. Brutal, powerful, and utterly unforgettable. His story is the story of the birth of a nation. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the most ruthless reign in English history. We hope you have enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Henry VIII. Goodbye.